Welcome to Explain Movie. This is the place where we take films apart and put them back together in a way that actually makes sense. Walking through the key scenes, the characters who drive them, the twists that catch you off guard, and the small details that give each story its own personality. If you're the kind of person who loves movies but also loves digging into what makes them tick, you've landed in the right spot. So get comfortable, settle in, and let's get into it. Taxi Driver, 1976, Cast, Craft, and Cultural Legacy. The cast: Jodie Foster got her start doing television commercials and series work before moving into film, and by the time she landed the role of Iris in Taxi Driver, she'd already appeared in Freaky Friday, 1976, and a handful of Disney pictures that showcased a poise well beyond her years. Iris was a different matter entirely. The material was genuinely controversial given how mature the subject was, but Foster's performance won over critics anyway, praised for its emotional honesty. She gave Iris real warmth and grit, refusing to let the character collapse into a mere symbol in Travis's unraveling psyche. Foster's career only grew from there. She moved smoothly into adult roles and eventually became one of Hollywood's most decorated actresses, picking up Academy Awards for The Accused and The Silence of the Lambs. Taxi Driver was where she first proved she could carry serious dramatic weight. Albert Brooks was briefly in the running for a role in the film, but the part of Sport Iris's manipulative pimp ultimately went to Harvey Keitel, who had already worked with Scorsese on Mean Streets, playing a troubled young man tangled up in New York's criminal world. Keitel had a reputation for gritty, high-intensity performances, and as Sport he brought something quieter but no less unsettling, a calm, persuasive menace that made the character feel all the more dangerous. The role helped cement Keitel as a fixture of American independent film, and he'd go on to work with directors like Quentin Tarantino and Abel Ferrara. Sybil Shepherd played Betsy, the political campaign worker Travis becomes fixated on. She'd already made a name for herself as a model and actress, breaking through in Peter Bogdanovich's The Last Picture Show, 1971, a film that turned her into something of an emblem of 1970s American beauty and emotional nuance. In Taxi Driver, Betsy stands in for a version of society Travis longs for but can never truly reach, and Shepherd plays her with a deliberate reserve that mirrors the character's emotional and professional distance. After the film, she kept working steadily and later found major success on television with moonlighting alongside Bruce Willis, which gave her career a second wind in the 1980s. Peter Boyle took on the role of Wizard, a fellow cabbie who offers Travis a bit of hard-won wisdom, or at least tries to. Boyle was already a respected character actor known for moving easily between comedy and drama. He'd appeared in The Socially Charged Joe, 1970, and later showed off his comic chops in Young Frankenstein, 1974. His screen time in Taxi Driver is limited, but his presence matters. Wizard represents a kind of emotional detachment as a survival strategy in the city, a philosophy that stands in stark contrast to Travis's spiraling instability. Leonard Harris played Charles Palantine, the presidential candidate whose campaign employs Betsy. Harris wasn't a career actor. He was better known as a cultural critic and writer, and that background lends his performance a certain institutional realism. Palantine becomes something abstract for Travis, a stand-in for the political establishment he resents, even though the character itself is never given much depth. Joe Spinell rounds out the supporting cast as another cab driver working alongside Wizard, adding to the film's lived-in sense of working-class New York. Spinell built a career playing exactly this kind of grounded, street-level role in crime dramas. Taken together, the cast reflects a deliberate mix of up-and-coming talent, seasoned performers, and actors whose careers were about to pivot in a new direction. And for several of them, Taxi Driver marked exactly that turning point. A film of its moment, Taxi Driver landed in 1976, right in the middle of a genuinely unsettled period in American life. The country was still processing the fallout from Vietnam and Watergate. Crime was climbing in major cities like New York, and a broad sense of disillusionment had settled over much of the public. The film captured that mood with striking precision, and over the decades it grew into something bigger than a single character's breakdown. It became a cultural shorthand for alienation, urban decay, and the particular loneliness of modern life. Part of its lasting impact lies in how it shaped the visual and emotional vocabulary of urban storytelling. Countless films, TV shows, and music videos have since borrowed its imagery: neon-streaked streets, rain-slicked pavement, isolated figures drifting through crowds. The lone cab driver navigating a hostile city became a kind of shorthand for modern isolation, and the film helped popularize the archetype of the urban anti-hero, someone who lives inside society while remaining completely cut off from it. Then there's the line, "You talkin' to me?" It's become one of the most recognizable moments in film history, endlessly referenced, imitated, and parodied across movies, television, comedy, advertising, and internet culture. Acting schools still study the scene as a model of improvisational intensity and psychological unraveling, a proof that a single moment on screen can lodge itself permanently in the broader culture. The film also changed how mental health and trauma got portrayed on screen. Travis is a socially isolated Vietnam veteran dealing with insomnia and what looks a lot like PTSD, and while the film never explicitly names his condition, it invites the audience to sit with the ambiguity. Over time, Taxi Driver became part of a larger cultural conversation about veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life, helping raise awareness of the psychological toll of war. There's a political dimension too. The film's bleak, chaotic vision of New York shaped how a lot of people thought about the city during the 1970s. A decade marked by real economic decline and rising crime. Some critics felt the film overstated the danger, others thought it was simply telling the truth. Either way, it became woven into the broader story people told about American cities at the time. The film also found itself at the center of a much darker conversation about media and violence. In 1981, John Hinckley Jr.'s attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan was widely linked to an obsession with the film and its characters, which set off a wave of debate about whether violent films could influence vulnerable individuals. Taxi Driver doesn't glorify violence, but its psychological intensity and moral ambiguity made it an obvious touchstone in that discussion. Artistically, the film became a cornerstone of the new Hollywood movement, the era when directors like Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and William Friedkin pushed mainstream American cinema toward darker, more personal storytelling. Taxi Driver stood out for how uncompromising it was, proving that a film could be both artistically serious and commercially viable. Its reach went well beyond the US, too. Filmmakers across Europe, Asia, and Latin America have pointed to it as an influence, and directors like Wong Kar-wai, Park Chan-wook, and Nicholas Winding Refn have all drawn on its mood or visual language in their own work. Its fingerprints show up in music as well. Artists across hip-hop, rock, and electronic genres have referenced its themes of loneliness and disconnection, and the image of Travis rehearsing confrontation in the mirror has turned up repeatedly in music videos and album art as a symbol of inner conflict. Decades later, the film remains a fixture of internet culture, too, with its imagery and dialogue endlessly recycled in memes and digital art, sometimes earnestly and sometimes as a joke, a testament to how deeply it still resonates with modern feelings of urban isolation. It's no surprise the film is a staple of film school curricula, studied for its cinematography, structure, psychological depth, and social commentary. Students often focus on how it blurs the line between objective reality and Travis's subjective distortion of it, making it a rich case study in perspective and unreliable narration. Behind the scenes, the story of how Taxi Driver got made is nearly as compelling as the film itself, a mix of creative risk-taking, a director pushing his own boundaries, and a cast willing to go to uncomfortable places, all set against the backdrop of a genuinely difficult production environment in 1970s New York. Much of the film's DNA traces back to the working relationship between Scorsese and screenwriter Paul Schrader. Schrader wrote the script during a rough personal stretch dealing with depression, and, for a time, living out of his car and that isolation and existential unease bled directly into the character of Travis Bickle. He wrote it fast and with a kind of confessional urgency that gives the screenplay its raw edge. Scorsese, already gaining traction as a director thanks to Mean Streets, recognized the material immediately as a chance to dig into psychological storytelling in a genuinely cinematic way. Shooting took place on location in New York, largely at night, without the kind of controlled environment modern productions rely on. The decision gave the film its unmistakable grit, but it also made the shoot genuinely hard. Unpredictable weather, street noise, and real crowds who had no idea filming was even happening. The infamous apartment scene, where Travis mentally and physically prepares himself, was shot with meticulous care, using overhead shots and distorted angles to put the audience inside his headspace. The apartment itself was designed to feel claustrophobic and cluttered, a physical manifestation of his deteriorating mental state. Robert De Niro's preparation for the role has become the stuff of film legend. While on a break from another project in Europe, he actually got a taxi license and drove real shifts in New York, picking up real passengers and absorbing the rhythms of nighttime city life. Crew members later said he often stayed in character between takes, holding on to Travis's withdrawn, isolated demeanor even when the cameras were trolling. The now iconic "You Talkin' to Me?" scene grew out of that same commitment. It was largely improvised during rehearsal, shot in Travis's apartment with little more than a mirror, with Scorsese giving De Niro room to explore different emotional registers until they landed on something that felt both natural and deeply unsettling. Because Foster was a minor during filming, the production followed strict guidelines to protect her. Her scenes were closely supervised, and she worked alongside acting coaches and her family throughout. Despite the heavy subject matter, she brought a level of professionalism to the role that belied her age, and the crew took real care to shield her from anything inappropriate while she filmed. Keitel put in serious preparation of his own, working with Scorsese to nail sports calm, controlling presence and studying real figures from New York's underground to understand how manipulation could be expressed subtly rather than loudly. His scenes with Foster were carefully choreographed to keep things emotionally safe on set while still preserving the realism the film needed. Cinematographer Michael Chapman was another key architect of the film's identity, working with Scorsese to develop lighting techniques that conveyed isolation and the moral rot. Neon signage, wet street reflections, and deep shadow all played a part. Some scenes were shot handheld to heighten realism, while others relied on slow, deliberate tracking shots to build tension. The score, composed by the legendary Bernard Herrmann, turned out to be his final work. He died shortly after finishing the recording sessions with a full orchestra. Herrmann was initially reluctant to take the project on, but the script and a meeting with Scorsese changed his mind. The resulting jazz-inflected, haunting score became inseparable from the film's emotional texture, structure and story. Rather than unfolding as a conventional plot, Taxi Driver plays out as a psychological descent. On the surface, the story is straightforward. Travis Bickle, a lonely, unstable Vietnam veteran, takes a job driving a cab through New York at night. But the film is far more interested in his internal experience than in external events, tracking how isolation, sleeplessness, and obsession gradually warp his perception of everything around him. It opens with Travis taking the job largely because of his chronic insomnia, and from the start, his separation from everyone around him is obvious. He drifts through the city at night, watching but never really engaging. The early stretch of the film is episodic, following a parade of passengers who each represent a slice of urban life: couples, criminals, political operatives, ordinary citizens, and these encounters aren't just texture, they're the raw material feeding his growing disgust and alienation. The story's first real turn comes when Travis becomes infatuated with Betsy. For a moment, the relationship offers him something like hope and normalcy. He idealizes her as pure and morally untouched by the corruption he sees everywhere else. But his complete lack of social awareness sabotages things almost immediately. He takes her to a pornographic film on their date, apparently not registering that this isn't a normal thing to do. The relationship falls apart, and that rejection becomes a pivotal moment, curdling his loneliness into humiliation and resentment. From there, the film shifts more decisively towards psychological breakdown. Travis withdraws further, ramps up his physical training, changes his appearance, and starts fantasizing about violence, casting himself as a kind of moral enforcer. His interactions with others stop being about connection and start functioning as confirmation of his own worldview. The second major turning point arrives when he fixates on rescuing Iris, the teenage prostitute under sports control. He convinces himself he has a mission to save her and cleanse the corruption he sees in the world, a belief built not on any real understanding of her situation, but on the distorted moral logic he's constructed for himself. As his plan takes shape, the film's structure starts to fracture along with his sanity, leaning into subjective, fragmented imagery rather than objective storytelling. We see him acquiring weapons and rehearsing confrontations in the mirror, and the famous "You talkin' to me?" sequence functions as more than a striking character moment. It's the point where his identity visibly starts coming apart and reforming into something new. The climax builds toward a violence that feels both inevitable and jarring. Travis first attempts to assassinate Palantine but is thwarted by security, and redirects that violent energy toward the brothel where Iris is held. The resulting shootout is chaotic and stylized, told through fragmented images and shifting perspective that prioritize disorientation over clarity. What follows is genuinely strange. Rather than facing consequences, Travis is treated by the media and police as something of a hero, and Iris is sent back to her parents. The irony is stark. We've just watched a man's mental collapse in real time, yet society reframes it as an act of courage. The film closes on an eerie kind of calm. Travis is back behind the wheel, driving his cab at night. A passenger climbs in, and he glances at himself in the rearview mirror, a small gesture that leaves his mental state very much in question. There's no real resolution here, just a sense that the cycle could easily start again. Themes and symbolism. Taxi Driver runs deep on meaning, and much of its staying power comes from how it embeds its ideas into behavior, structure, and imagery rather than spelling anything out. At its core, it's grappling with alienation, moral decay, loneliness, violence, identity, and the erosion of meaning in modern city life. Isolation is the most persistent theme. Travis is surrounded by people every night, yet he never forms a genuine connection with any of them. The taxi itself becomes a potent symbol of this moving enclosure, a transparent wall between him and the world he drives through. He watches the city like a spectator rather than a participant, and even though the streets are teeming with life, they feel empty to him. It's a sharp illustration of how crowded urban spaces can still produce profound loneliness. Closely tied to that is moral decay. Travis repeatedly describes the city as filthy, in both a literal and moral sense, a perception that says as much about his own psychology as it does about the city itself. That imagery of filth recurs throughout: garbage-strewn streets, dark alleys, rain-soaked sidewalks, all echoing his belief that the world needs cleansing, a belief that eventually curdles into justification for violence. Identity fragmentation is another major thread. Travis keeps trying on different versions of himself: the polite suitor with Betsy, the disciplined self-made vigilante in training, the violent avenger preparing for a final act. His mirror scenes are the clearest expression of this. He's not just rehearsing lines, he's actively constructing a self. The reflection captures both self-awareness and self-deception, as if he's trying to become the person he thinks the world needs rather than accepting who he actually is. Violence in the film isn't simple or sudden. It builds gradually out of isolation, frustration, and distorted thinking. Travis doesn't start out violent. His transformation is slow and deeply psychological. The weapons he accumulates become stand-ins for the control and certainty he feels he lacks in a world he sees as chaotic, and the final act of violence is left morally ambiguous. Is it destruction, rescue, or pure delusion? The film never says. Then there's the theme of the self-appointed savior. Travis convinces himself he's meant to rescue Iris, but that conviction has more to do with his own need for purpose than with any real understanding of her as a person. She becomes symbolic to him, innocence, purity, redemption, rather than someone he actually knows, which is exactly the danger the film seems to be pointing at. Projecting meaning onto other people to justify your own instability. Religious undertones run through all of this too. Travis's violent transformation reads, to some, as a warped version of salvation. His mohawk and the bloody climax evoke ritual purification, though the film never confirms that reading outright, leaving it open whether this is genuine meaning or just further delusion. New York itself functions almost like a character, chaotic, anonymous, morally murky. The endless rain, neon glow, and nighttime setting create a world that feels simultaneously real and surreal, shifting between clarity and distortion in step with Travis's own mental state. Mirrors and reflections recur constantly as symbols of duality and self-confrontation, and rain shows up again and again during moments of tension, both washing the city clean and blurring what's visible. A fitting metaphor for the film's refusal to offer moral clarity. Even the taxi carries symbolic weight beyond its practical function. Constant motion without any real progress, a fitting image for a man who's always moving but never actually getting anywhere. These threads all feed into one another. Alienation breeds fragmentation. Fragmentation breeds distortion. Distortion breeds violence. But the film resists presenting that as a tidy chain of cause and effect. Instead, it builds a symbolic world where meaning stays unstable, which is exactly what makes it endure. It's not just the story of one man falling apart, but a broader meditation on identity and purpose in a disconnected world. Visual style. Taxi Driver is one of the most visually distinctive films of its era, thanks largely to the partnership between Scorsese and cinematographer Michael Chapman. None of the visual choices here are just decorative. Every frame is built to reflect Travis's psychology and the moral haze of the story around him. Nighttime dominates the film. Most of it unfolds after dark, turning the city into a glowing, unstable space thick with neon, reflections, and steam. That choice isn't incidental. It reinforces the sense of distortion and alienation running through the story. The city is never presented as fully legible. It's always filtered through darkness, rain, or haze, giving the whole film a dreamlike quality that mirrors Travis's mental state. Chapman often favors slow, deliberate camera movement that lets the audience take in the environment rather than just track the action. The tracking shots of the taxi gliding through the streets are especially effective. Smooth but emotionally distant, underlining that Travis is always moving through the world without ever really being part of it. The camera tends to stay outside emotional peaks, observing from a slight remove, which only deepens that sense of detachment. Color does a lot of heavy lifting too. Deep reds, sickly greens, and muted yellows dominate the palette. Red shows up constantly in neon and interior lighting, often signaling danger or corruption. Green washes over several interior scenes, especially in Travis's apartment, giving it an unnatural, almost toxic quality. None of it is meant to look realistic. It's stylized to convey emotional truth rather than accuracy. Reflections are one of the film's most important visual motifs. Windows, mirrors, and glass constantly split the frame, isolating characters within layered compositions. Travis is frequently shown through glass or reflected surfaces, a visual shorthand for his separation from everyone around him. And the mirror scenes in his apartment push that even further. staging him in direct confrontation with his own image to express his fracturing sense of self without a word of dialogue. The lighting throughout is deliberately expressive, often pitting harsh artificial light against deep shadow. Interiors tend to be dimly lit with a single strong source, creating sharp contrast between what's visible and what's hidden, a visual language of partial exposure that suits a film where nothing is ever fully clear, morally or otherwise. Travis himself is framed with isolation in mind, often alone in wide shots, surrounded by empty space or distant crowds. Even in busy environments, inside the cab, he's frequently shot behind the wheel or through the windshield, a literal barrier between him and the outside world. It's a consistent choice that turns physical space into psychological commentary. Handheld camera work shows up selectively, mostly in moments of tension or violence, introducing a jittery instability that mirrors his unraveling. But the film doesn't lean on this style constantly. It alternates between controlled composition and the moments of chaos, creating a rhythm that tracks his shifting mental state. One of the most striking images in the film is the overhead shot following the aftermath of the final shootout. As the camera looks straight down, flattening the space and creating an almost clinical distance from the violence, refusing the audience any easy emotional resolution. Slow zooms appear throughout as well, gradually tightening on Travis's face or surroundings instead of cutting straight to a close-up. It's a subtle technique that builds psychological pressure while keeping a low hum of unease running underneath. Even though the film is shot in a real city, it presents a heightened, almost cinematic version of New York. Streets look emptier than they'd actually be. Lighting is exaggerated for mood over accuracy, and steam, flashing signs, and wet pavement all contribute to an atmosphere that feels both grounded and surreal. Interior spaces get the same treatment. Travis's apartment is cluttered and visually dense, often shot with objects crowding the foreground to create a feeling of confinement that mirrors his mental state. The film also plays with symmetry and imbalance, as some scenes are carefully centered for a sense of order, others intentionally off-kilter to create discomfort, and contrasts the constant motion of the taxi sequences with the stillness of interior scenes, echoing the disconnect between Travis's outward movement and his lack of any real internal progress. Sound and score. The soundscape of Taxi Driver does just as much work as its visuals in building the film's sense of isolation, paranoia, and unease. Sound here isn't just atmosphere, it actively reflects Travis's inner state and the world around him. At the center of it all is Bernard Herrmann's score. Herrmann was already a legend by this point, best known for his work with Alfred Hitchcock on films like Psycho and Vertigo, and Taxi Driver became his last completed score before his death, a fact that gives the music an added weight in hindsight. His compositions here lean heavily on jazz, slow rhythms, and haunting orchestral textures that feel simultaneously romantic and unsettling, anchored by saxophone melodies that drift through the film like stray memories. There's no comfort or resolution in the music. It reinforces a sense that Travis is moving through a world that never quite settles. The jazz influence also ties the film to New York's nightlife, blending music that seems to come from the world of the story with music that clearly comments on it from outside. Herrmann's restraint is part of what makes the score so effective. It doesn't play constantly, but surfaces in carefully chosen moments, often at points of emotional isolation or transition. That selective use makes the silences feel just as loaded as the music itself. And there's a lot of silence in this film. Many scenes, especially inside the taxi or apartment, are stripped down to minimal ambient sound, which sharpens the viewer's awareness of small details, footsteps, distant sirens, the hum of an engine, and creates an uncomfortably exposed feeling. The taxi's own sounds are the engine, the click of the meter, the ambient noise of traffic, form a kind of rhythmic backdrop that mirrors Travis's routine existence, separating him from the world outside even as it places him squarely within it. The city's soundscape, meanwhile, is dense with overlapping traffic, horns, construction, and sirens, but it's mixed in a way that feels slightly filtered, as though Travis isn't fully absorbing any of it, as sometimes overwhelming, sometimes strangely distant, mirroring his unstable state of mind. Radio broadcasts drift in and out of the film too, fragments of music, talk, and advertising that represent the outside world briefly intruding on Travis's isolation without ever really connecting him to it. During his training and preparation scenes, music disappears almost entirely, replaced by the cold, clinical sounds of exercise equipment and breathing, turning routine physical actions into something closer to ritual. By the time the climactic violence hits, the sound design turns chaotic. Gunshots, shouting, and disorienting spatial audio overwhelm the clarity that defined earlier scenes, and notably, Herman's score mostly drops away, letting raw chaos take over. Afterward, the sound design pulls back into something quieter and more reflective, with the city once again feeling distant and contained, a contrast that underscores just how unresolved everything really is. There's also a psychological subjectivity built into the sound throughout. Moments of tension often come with exaggerated or subtly distorted ambient noise, hinting that what we're hearing isn't objective reality but Travis's own filtered experience of it. Between Herman's score and the film's grounded environmental sound, the film ends up running two parallel audio tracks, one emotional, one realistic, that constantly interact without ever fully merging. Critical and public reception. Taxi Driver arrived as one of the most talked about films of 1976, and its reception was every bit as complicated as the film itself. A critical acclaim mixed with public fascination, discomfort, and outright controversy. It didn't just entertain audiences, it unsettled them and pushed them to confront hard questions about violence and psychological instability. Its critical standing has only strengthened over time, and it's now regarded as one of the essential works in American film history. At the time, critics largely praised it, singling out Scorsese's direction and De Niro's transformative performance. Reviewers pointed to the bold visual style, the psychological depth, and the unflinching look at urban alienation, and Paul Schrader's screenplay was frequently called out for its intensity and introspection, a disturbing but powerful character study, in the words of many critics of the time. Rather than offering easy moral answers, the film presented a genuinely ambiguous portrait of a broken man in the fractured society. Its violence sparked immediate debate, too. Some critics worried about the potential psychological impact of the graphic final shootout, particularly because the film refused to frame the violence as clearly heroic or justified, in the way conventional action films of the era usually did. That ambiguity unsettled some viewers and struck others as one of the film's greatest strengths. Audiences were similarly split. Many were captivated by the atmosphere, the performances, and the raw realism. Others found it genuinely disturbing or hard to parse. Travis Bickle wasn't a typical protagonist, and his behavior tested audience expectations of sympathy, as some viewers felt for his loneliness, others recoiled from his growing detachment. And that split reaction is part of why the film has always generated conversation rather than passive viewing. The film's reputation became entangled with real-world controversy in the early 1980s, after it was widely linked to an attempt on the life of a U.S. political leader, reigniting debate about whether violent films could influence vulnerable viewers. The film never advocated for violence, but its psychological intensity made it an easy reference point in that discussion, and that controversy has remained a part of its historical legacy ever since. Despite all that, the industry recognized the film early on. It picked up multiple award nominations and won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, cementing its status as a serious artistic achievement rather than simply a provocative one. Critical consensus has only grown more favorable with time, and scholars and filmmakers alike now routinely count it among the greatest films ever made. It's a fixture of academic film criticism, regularly discussed in relation to alienation, masculinity, and modern identity, and it's held up as a defining work of the new Hollywood era's shift toward darker, more introspective filmmaking. What was once viewed by some as unsettling or even irresponsible is now widely seen as visionary, with modern critics emphasizing its psychological complexity over its violence. Contemporary audiences, armed with a better understanding of mental health and trauma, tend to read Travis as a tragic, fractured figure rather than simply a dangerous one. Though the film's ending still fuels debate about morality and meaning, few films manage to stay this relevant this long. Taxi Driver's reputation hasn't faded with time, it's grown, and it remains a constant presence in university courses, critical retrospectives, and popular culture alike. Legacy Taxi Driver's influence extends well past the film itself, shaping visual storytelling, character archetypes, and even the broader cultural conversation around urban life and psychological struggle. What sets its legacy apart isn't just that it inspired imitators, it's that it changed how filmmakers approach character studies, moral ambiguity, and subjective storytelling altogether. In the years after its release, a wave of filmmakers began exploring similarly dark, introspective stories built around isolated, marginalized protagonists. The urban anti-hero became a much more common figure in film. A socially disconnected, psychologically unstable, morally grey, and Taxi Driver proved that audiences would engage deeply with a lead character who wasn't conventionally likable, opening the door to more complex, character-driven storytelling. Scorsese's direction became a template of its own, with his subjective camera work, expressive lighting, and emotionally charged urban settings influencing generations of filmmakers who study the balance he strikes between realism and stylization, a world that feels authentic and distorted all at once. That approach shows up again and again in later films trying to depict mental instability through image rather than exposition. De Niro's performance, meanwhile, became one of the most referenced in film history. His method-driven, physically and psychologically immersive approach set a bar that plenty of actors have cited as an influence when preparing for emotionally demanding roles, and the mirror scene remains a staple in film schools as a case study in how improvisation and repetition can produce real psychological power. Internationally, filmmakers drawing on themes of alienation and urban decay have pointed to Taxi Driver as a touchstone. Its fingerprints show up in European cinema's explorations of existential isolation and in Asian urban dramas and psychological thrillers built around neon-lit cities and fractured identities. In a real sense, it helped establish a shared cinematic language for depicting loneliness in the modern city. The film's imagery has taken on a life of its own in popular culture. Travis's mohawk, sunglasses, and military jacket have become iconic shorthand for urban rebellion and inner turmoil, showing up in fashion, photography, and music videos, while the mirror scene gets referenced constantly as a visual symbol of isolation and internal conflict. Musicians across hip-hop, rock, and electronic genres have drawn on its atmosphere, and its aesthetic. Neon lighting, introspective nighttime imagery has made its way onto album covers and into music videos and lyrics. Television has absorbed its influence as well, particularly in the rise of psychologically complex anti-hero characters and darker storytelling that lets a protagonist's mental state shape the narrative itself, an approach that owes a real debt to what Taxi Driver pioneered. Academically, it remains a fixture in film studies, psychology courses, and cultural theory, with Travis Bickle functioning as a recurring case study in conversations about isolation, distorted perception, and trauma, and the film itself frequently examined in debates about media influence and the ethics of depicting violence on screen. It also helped define an entire filmmaking era. As one of the defining works of New Hollywood, Taxi Driver stands as proof that American cinema could shift toward more personal, director-driven storytelling and still succeed. Its impact helped validate that shift and encouraged studios to back more ambitious, unconventional projects. It also changed how cities get portrayed on screen more broadly. turning New York into a symbolic space that's both physically real and emotionally charged, a template of neon, rain, and isolation that still shows up in films decades later. The film hasn't faded from the digital world either. Its scenes and dialogue continue to circulate in memes, edits, and online discussion, and "You Talkin' to Me?" remains instantly recognizable, used to express everything from genuine frustration to comic exaggeration. Maybe the most striking part of its legacy, though, is simply how much it still resonates emotionally. Taxi Driver continues to speak to people who feel cut off from the world around them, overwhelmed by city life, or uncertain of their own place in it. Themes that were never really tied to a specific decade, and that's exactly why they've endured. How audiences have responded over time. Taxi Driver has always provoked strong reactions, and those reactions have shifted as culture, psychology, and social attitudes have evolved. From its earliest screenings to today, it's kept audiences talking about loneliness, violence, identity, and morality in the modern city. And what's notable is how rarely it leaves anyone neutral. People tend to engage deeply with it, feel genuinely disturbed by it, or reinterpret it entirely depending on their own background. At release, many viewers were struck by just how uncomfortably realistic it felt, particularly anyone who had actually experienced 1970s New York and its economic struggles and crime. Some saw it as an honest reflection of that reality. Others thought it exaggerated the danger. That split became part of the film's identity from the start. It never offered a single, tidy read on reality. Travis himself has always produced complicated reactions. Early on, plenty of viewers feel for him. His insomnia, his isolation, his fumbling attempts to connect are all relatable in a certain light. But as his behavior grows more unstable, that sympathy tends to erode, forcing audiences to reckon with whether empathy should be conditional on someone's behavior or their psychological state. A lot of the ongoing debate comes down to whether Travis is a victim, a villain, or something messier in between. Some read him as a man shaped and damaged by war and isolation, others as someone whose fantasies simply curdled into real harm. The film never settles the question, which is exactly why people are still arguing about it. Newer generations tend to bring a different lens to the material, often more fluent in the language of trauma and mental health, which shifts the conversation away from moral judgment and towards psychological understanding. Less is Travis good or bad and more what shaped him this way. At the same time, the film's themes of loneliness amid crowds resonate in a new way with people navigating modern digital life, where constant connectivity often coexists with real isolation. That's a big part of why the film hasn't dated the way a lot of its era has. Online communities have played their own role in keeping the conversation alive, revisiting scenes like the mirror sequence or the final confrontation across forums, video essays, and social platforms, ranging from serious psychological analysis to more playful or ironic reinterpretation. A proof that the film lives comfortably in both intellectual and pop culture spaces at once. The ending remains one of the most debated parts of the film. Some read it as a kind of redemption, with Travis having completed a genuine act of rescue. Others see it as deeply ironic, a demonstration of how easily society mistakes violence for heroism, or a sign that Travis's underlying instability never actually resolved. That ambiguity keeps the conversation going long after the credits roll, as viewers try to reconcile what they've seen with their own sense of right and wrong. Emotional responses run the gamut. Some viewers describe real discomfort at the film's slow, realistic descent into violence, others are drawn in by its atmosphere and craftsmanship, and some engage with it primarily as a technical achievement in filmmaking. Even the setting itself becomes a kind of emotional touchstone. Viewers who've never set foot in New York often feel they understand its texture through the film, reading the city as hostile, or lonely but quietly alive, depending on what they bring to it. And for plenty of people, watching the film becomes an act of self-reflection. Not identifying with Travis's actions, but recognizing something of his loneliness or search for meaning in themselves, which is a big part of why the film's psychological impact has lasted as long as it has. Character arcs. Taxi Driver works primarily as a character study rather than a plot-driven film, and its power comes from how gradually its central figures evolve or, in most cases, fail to. Even characters with limited screen time serve to shape, contrast, or reflect Travis Bickle's unraveling worldview. Travis's own arc is the most significant, and it's less about traditional growth than about exposure and breakdown. He starts out quiet and withdrawn, dealing with insomnia and isolation, watching the city from a careful distance rather than engaging with it. At this stage, he's defined more by confusion and loneliness than aggression, and he even makes a real effort to fit in, cleaning himself up to court Betsy. That relationship's collapse marks the real turning point. Instead of processing the rejection in any healthy way, he internalizes it and starts reinterpreting the world through a lens of corruption and decay. From there, his transformation is less about becoming more aggressive and more about becoming ideologically rigid, constructing an identity for himself as a kind of moral enforcer through isolation and internal monologue. His mirror conversations capture this process directly. He's not just rehearsing dialogue, he's actively building a self. By the film's climax, he's moved from passive observer to active participant in violence, a shift the film frames not as triumph but as a kind of psychological collapse fused with a sense of purpose. There's no clean resolution here, just ambiguity about whether he's achieved any real clarity or simply completed a fantasy. Betsy's arc runs in a quieter, contrasting direction. In Travis's imagination she represents purity and stability, but the real Betsy is simply grounded and professionally competent, and her arc is really one of disillusionment rather than transformation. After their disastrous date, she recognizes clearly that she and Travis are incompatible, and her decision to pull away is less a dramatic turn than a return to her own stability, a grounding presence that highlights just how far outside normal social boundaries Travis has drifted. Iris's arc, played by Jodie Foster, blends vulnerability with real resilience. She starts out trapped under sports control, seemingly passive within her circumstances, but over the course of the film she reveals real emotional clarity in her conversations with Travis, caught between resignation and a quiet desire for a normal life. Her arc is forcibly altered in the final act when Travis intervenes. She's physically removed from her situation, but the emotional aftermath is left largely implied rather than resolved, which keeps her arc feeling incomplete in a way that mirrors the disruption of her life rather than offering any tidy transformation. Sport, by contrast, barely changes at all, and that consistency is exactly the point. Keitel plays him as calm, manipulative, and self-assured throughout, a stable presence next to Travis's volatility. His static nature underscores a different kind of power, control and manipulation rather than emotional instability, exposing a corrupt but functioning system rather than undergoing any real arc of his own. Palantine, similarly, stays fairly static, but he matters as a symbol to Travis. He represents institutional authority, even though the film never develops him as a real person. His flatness reinforces the idea that Travis's real conflict is with abstract social structures, not individuals. Wizard offers a brief but meaningful presence too, without much personal development, but his interactions with Travis highlight the gap between lived experience and psychological detachment, suggesting that surviving the city is more about adaptation than transformation. Together, the supporting characters function almost like mirrors, each reflecting a different response to the same environment. Adapting, exploiting, withdrawing, observing, which lets the film keep its emotional focus squarely on Travis while still sketching a fuller social world around him. Costume and set design in Taxi Driver aren't just visual dressing, they're core storytelling tools, reflecting psychological states, class divisions, and the emotional texture of 1970s New York. Every wardrobe choice and interior space is built to reinforce the film's themes of isolation, decay, and identity confusion, grounded in realism but loaded with symbolic meaning. Travis's military surplus jacket and utilitarian look are the film's most iconic costume choice, immediately signaling his disconnection from mainstream society. The jacket ties him visually to his past as a Vietnam veteran. Even though the film never dwells on battlefield memories directly, it becomes a symbol of unresolved identity, hinting at the psychological weight he's still carrying while trying to function in civilian life, and a quiet longing for the structure and discipline the military once gave him. As the story progresses, that same outfit starts to read less like clothing and more like armor, part of his self-styled transformation into a figure of judgment and action, a visual consistency that also underscores his rigidity, his inability to adapt. Betsy's wardrobe, by contrast, signals order and professionalism, a clean, structured clothing suited to office and political work, reflecting a clarity of identity that stands in sharp contrast to Travis's disheveled look. The gap in their costuming visually captures the emotional and social distance between them. Iris's costuming reflects her vulnerability and lack of control, minimal and largely dictated by sport, using subtlety rather than exaggeration to convey how her identity has been shaped by outside forces rather than her own agency. Sports clothing, meanwhile, is stylish but understated, projecting confidence and control rather than chaos, a sharp contrast to Travis that reinforces how different forms of power can coexist within the same world. The film's set design is just as deliberate. New York isn't a passive backdrop here, it's a living psychological environment, with streets, apartments, diners, theaters, and cab interiors all contributing to a consistent, oppressive atmosphere, dense and noisy, yet somehow emotionally hollow. Travis's apartment is one of the film's most important sets, small and cluttered in a way that visually mirrors his fraying mental state, packed with personal items, exercise gear, firearms, and improvised equipment, lit harshly enough to feel disconnected from anything like normal domestic life. The taxi functions as another crucial set, a tight, enclosed mobile space that both isolates Travis and keeps him in constant proximity to the world, framing him through windows and mirrors in a way that reinforces his separation even when he's surrounded by people. Public spaces, streets, diners, adult theaters, they are designed to feel fragmented rather than unified, full of movement but empty of real connection. The adult theater in particular uses dim, repetitive lighting to create a sense of moral and psychological decay, functioning as a space of discomfort rather than a simple location. Lighting throughout ties closely to the set design, with low, directional sources creating sharp contrast between what's illuminated and what's left in shadow, a visual reinforcement of the film's total absence of moral clarity. Neon signage and city lights round it out, reflecting off wet streets and windows to build layered, blurred compositions where reality and reflection start to bleed together, a visually restless world that's constantly active but emotionally distant. The screenplay, Paul Schrader's script for Taxi Driver, is one of the most distinctive parts of the film's identity, not a dialogue-heavy screenplay in the traditional sense, but a carefully built psychological framework where silence, observation, and internal monologue often do more work than spoken words. When dialogue does appear, it tends to be sharp or unsettling, revealing character through implication rather than direct explanation. Travis's voiceover narration is the script's defining feature, giving the audience direct access to his thoughts. Though far from an objective guide, it's a window into a genuinely distorted view of reality. His language is simple, fragmented, sometimes crudely philosophical, as he tries to impose moral order onto his surroundings, framing the city in terms of cleanliness versus filth. The narration shapes how we understand events, but it also raises real questions about reliability, since everything is filtered through his unstable mind. Dialogue throughout is intentionally sparse, especially around Travis, whose social awkwardness comes through in short, hesitant exchanges. His conversations with Betsy start off seeming ordinary but gradually reveal just how little he understands normal social cues. The rhythm is always slightly off, a subtle writing choice that conveys his isolation without ever spelling it out. His speech patterns lean on repetition and simplicity, blunt observations and moral judgments rather than complex emotional expression, which isn't a weakness in the writing so much as a deliberate reflection of his inner state, creating a real contrast between the intensity he feels and what he's actually able to communicate. The mirror scene, with its "you talkin' to me?" line, remains one of the most iconic pieces of dialogue in film history, notable partly because it isn't dialogue in the conventional sense at all. It's self-directed speech performed in total isolation, a repeated phrase that shows Travis literally construct an identity through language. Scorsese gave De Niro room to improvise here, which is a big part of why the scene feels so natural and so unsettling at once. Less communication than performance or self-definition. Other characters use dialogue very differently. Betsy speaks with control and professional restraint, underscoring her place within a structured, functional society. Sports dialogue is smooth and persuasive, a tool of quiet influence that contrasts sharply with Travis's fragmented speech and helps define the film's power dynamics. Speech as leverage for some, a struggle for connection for Travis. Many of his interactions fail not through open conflict but through simple disconnect, conversations trailing off or ending abruptly, reinforcing the film's larger theme of alienation playing out even at the level of language itself. Silence is just as important as dialogue in the script. Long pauses, unanswered questions, incomplete exchanges all build tension and depend on what's left unsaid. The pacing reflects this too. Conversations unfold slowly, often interrupted by outside noise or Travis's own inner reflection, mirroring the stretched, fragmented sense of time that defines his experience. The script also weaves in moments of quasi-philosophical language, particularly in Travis's narration, where his descriptions of moral corruption read as projections of his own worldview rather than literal fact, left deliberately ambiguous rather than validated or dismissed outright. What makes the writing work is its balance between grounded realism and the everyday rhythms of taxi conversations and street exchanges and the more poetic, introspective quality of the internal narration, letting the script function simultaneously as social observation and psychological character study. That balance tightens in the final act, where dialogue thins out almost entirely in favor of silence and physical preparation, a clear signal that language has stopped being adequate to the tension the film has been building all along. Marketing and promotion. The way Taxi Driver was marketed reflects both the era it came from and its unusual position within mainstream American film. It wasn't built for spectacle or franchise-style advertising. The promotion instead leaned on atmosphere, psychological intensity, and the growing reputations of its creative team, which meant communicating a genuinely difficult idea to audiences. This wasn't conventional entertainment, but a disturbing, morally murky character study. A big part of the marketing strategy centered on Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese, both still rising talents at the time rather than the icons they'd later become. Promotional materials emphasized De Niro's dramatic transformation and Scorsese's emerging reputation as a bold new voice, positioning the film as serious art rather than typical studio fare and preparing audiences for something raw and emotionally demanding. The posters leaned into that same idea, with the most iconic image showing Travis standing alone on a moody, nocturnal city street. No action, no ensemble shots, just solitude, echoing the film's central theme rather than promising conventional plot or spectacle. The taglines followed suit, focusing on loneliness and urban alienation rather than excitement or romance, which was a fairly unusual approach for the time and helped draw in audiences looking for serious drama, even if it may have thrown off viewers expecting something more conventional. Trailers were built around mood rather than plot, offering glimpses of Travis driving at night, fumbling through awkward interactions, and narrating his own inner thoughts say enough to build curiosity without giving away the story, edited with the same slow, disjointed rhythm as the film itself to create a sense of unease before anyone had even seen it. Much of the early buzz came from festival screenings and industry word of mouth, with critics and filmmakers helping build anticipation well before general release, positioning the film as a serious artistic achievement rather than pure entertainment. Print media, newspapers, film magazines, did most of the heavy lifting in shaping public perception, with reviews and interviews focused heavily on its realism and controversial subject matter, and that critical conversation became part of the marketing itself, feeding public curiosity. Television promotion existed but was more limited by the standards of the day, mostly short spots emphasizing De Niro's performance and the film's overall intensity rather than plot specifics. The marketing also indirectly tapped into the era's broader anxieties about crime and urban decline and political instability, even without addressing them head-on. Its imagery aligned naturally with concerns already on the public's mind, which helped the film land with audiences already primed to think about those issues. And unlike modern blockbuster campaigns, there was no merchandising or product tie-in push here. The promotion stayed minimal and focused on cinematic credibility rather than commercial expansion, reinforcing its identity as art rather than franchise product. As the film's reputation grew after release, its marketing identity shifted from commercial to cultural. Iconic imagery, especially Travis's mohawk in the final act, began circulating well beyond official promotional material, and film festivals helped cement its international credibility, with award recognition solidifying its status as a genuinely important work rather than a niche or controversial curiosity. Taxi Driver. In context, Taxi Driver comes into sharper focus when placed alongside other films that share its themes, style, or creative lineage. Comparing it to earlier, contemporary, and later works shows how it both belongs to and reshapes cinematic tradition, tracing a line through character-driven dramas, urban crime films, psychological studies, and the modern anti-hero narratives that followed. One obvious comparison point is the broader New Hollywood movement of the 1970s. Films like The Godfather, 1972, Mean Streets, 1973, and The French Connection, 1971, share its interest in moral ambiguity, urban settings, and complicated male leads. But Taxi Driver pushes further into pure subjectivity. Where The Godfather builds a structured crime saga with its own internal logic, Taxi Driver narrows almost entirely onto a single unstable mind, collapsing reality down to one distorted lens rather than balancing multiple perspectives. The comparison to Mean Streets is especially telling, since both films share Scorsese and De Niro and both explore urban masculinity and the moral conflict. But where Mean Streets is grounded in friendship and small-time criminal community, Taxi Driver strips that away entirely. There's no social network holding Travis in place. The city becomes his only real environment, and even that gets filtered entirely through his own perception, marking a real evolution in how Scorsese approaches storytelling, from social dynamics toward pure psychological isolation. A useful later comparison is American Psycho, 2000, a film that picks up similar threads of alienation and unstable perception in a very different cultural context.